这种。
固定迭代、浮动迭代和浮动迭代。
固定代与浮动，清算是清算支出吗？哦，这是。看一个 prior fixed charge to subsequent floating charge， 就是一开始是 fixed， 后来变成了 floating subsequent floating， 接下来的 floating 嘛，然后。
Okay, for today there was less reading, but needed careful attention, especially the cases. We're moving from. First part was straight equity financing, the first 3 sessions, including the introduction. Then last session, debt financing, and now we're coming into the in-between stuff, mezzanine finance. So this session and the next session that we'll have together will be on subordination of debt. Subordination of debt can occur either voluntarily because someone agrees to be subordinated and rank lower, or involuntarily, because a statute or court-made rules order that a certain debt is subordinated to others. Just to be sure that we're talking about the same thing, what does subordination mean? What do we mean by subordination?
In bankruptcy, the creditor get payment subordinated after the other creditor.
Yeah. So we're talking about always with a view to bankruptcy, when there are not enough assets for everyone, not sufficient assets for all creditors, then rank is essential. Do I rank on top, then I get probably everything, or do I rank on the bottom, then I get very little. So remember, like on the train platform, when the cart is empty and 3 people are standing there, you can be very polite and say, you go first, but if the car is full and you see no seats left and 50 people standing, everybody wants to be first. And that's the situation in bankruptcy. As long as the company has enough assets to satisfy everyone, rank, priority is not an issue. You know, why should you care whether you get your money 5 minutes earlier or later? That doesn't make any difference. But when there is not enough for everyone, of course, then it's essential and crucial who comes first to be satisfied. And of course, you all know, and this plays a role today, there is the opportunity or possibility to obtain certain types of security interests for your claims. Secured creditors rank first. I think in almost probably all bankruptcy laws, if you have a validly established security interest over certain assets of the debtor. Prime example, a mortgage on a piece of real estate. The debtor has a piece of land, and you obtain a security interest over that piece of land. In most countries, certainly in Germany, that needs to be registered in the land register so everyone can see, you know, this land is encumbered, there is a security interest on this land. If somebody buys the land, he buys it or she buys it encumbered with a security interest, so the security interest does not cease to exist when the asset is transferred to someone else. It just goes with the asset. And of course, if I sell an asset on which over which a security interest has been established, say a piece of land worth €1 million, and there is a mortgage for €500,000 securing a claim of €500,000, that means I will get only €500,000 for the land, because if the creditor seizes the land and enforces his security interest, this €500,000 security interest will have to be paid off the land. So potentially the land might be sold, and €500,000 of the proceeds will go to the owner of the security, holder of the security interest. And that means in bankruptcy, secured creditors are in a nice position, right? That's why last week we also talked about the covenants, where you obtain a covenant that there will be no security interest given to other creditors, because then you're in a worse position. You might be willing to give an unsecured loan, but only if nobody else gets a security interest. So, negative pledge covenant. is due to that fact. Okay, so secured creditors, about which we will be talking today in much of the class, when we talk about the port-based clothing case, have a prior position over unsecured creditors. And as you may know, and it's probably the case in China, if you have a valuable piece of land, say worth 10 billion units in money, whatever, whatever the currency may be, $10 billion, say, and you have several creditors, one for $1 million, another one for $2 million, another one for $3 million, so total $6 million. You can establish several security interests over one asset. So, I mean, if the first one comes with this claim for $1 million and wants a mortgage, you can give that person a mortgage for $1 million. But then the value, the leftover value of the land is still $9 million, assuming the value of the land is $10 million. So the second creditor comes and says, I want a second mortgage for my $2 million claim. So give him a second mortgage, $2 million. Leftover value, residual value of the land, $7 million, minus the $3 million. Third creditor comes and also wants a mortgage. So you give that creditor a mortgage over $3 million. So $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, total $6 million. Land is encumbered with 3 mortgages of a total $6 million, $4 million residual value. And now you have 3, and assume you're going bankrupt now. You have 3 creditors, all with security interests over the same asset. Question, how are they satisfied when the piece of land is sold? In other words, if you have several holders of security interests over the same, we talked about priority of creditors, right? Secured creditors rank above unsecured creditors, senior creditors above junior creditors. How about several secured creditors with security interests over the same assets, in my case, the same piece of land? And let's assume the piece of land, when it is sold in bankruptcy, fetches only $5 million. You know, sometimes that happens. I mean, an asset may be very valuable, but if you're forced to sell it and people know you're forced to sell it, they're not going to give you a market price. They're going to exploit the situation and say, you know, you need the money, I don't need the land, you need the money. If you want money, I give you $5 million, take it or leave it. So the land, in my example, is sold for $5 million. But you have security interests over $6 million. So you have the first security interest $1 million, the second $2 million, the third $3 million, total $6 million. Proceeds of the sale only $5 million. My question again, who gets how much?
Normally, according to the law, it depends on whether they get some public notification at first, whether they perfection their mortgage, whether just simply who is the first one gets.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you could say everyone, you have 3 security interests, $6 million, total proceeds of sale $5 million, so divided up evenly. Everybody gets, I don't know, 10%, 15% less. Would be one rule, but that is, at least in Germany, and I think in most other countries, not the rule. The rule in most countries is the creditors are satisfied according to the priority of their security interests. And usually, when you have security interests that are registered somewhere in a register, as is the case with land, the rank and priority is determined according to the date when the registration took place. So the first security interest registered first gets $1 million. The second, registered second, $2 million. And now there's only $2 million left, so the third one with $3 million only gets $2 million. So again, there's not only a rank between shareholders, equity holders, and creditors, where creditors are first and shareholders last. There is a potential order of priority between unsecured creditors. So you may have senior creditors who come first before others, if there is such an agreement, or by order of law. some unsecured creditors are subordinated to other unsecured creditors, and there may also be an order of priority among secured creditors, so that usually according to the order in which the security interests were established. I don't know about Chinese law. In Germany and most European laws, it's according to the time, order of time when the security interests were established. So the first one is first, the second is second. When there is registration, the first one registered first, the second one second, and so forth. When you have security interests that are not registered, then it goes according to the order of time in which the security interests were established. So the rule is whoever comes first, who is second. Pretty simple. Okay, that's the normal order of priority of secured creditors. And now, as we're approaching our case, one issue is, for whose benefit do we have this order of priority? For whose benefit do we have the rule that the first one is first, the second one is second? Usually for the benefit of the creditors. I mean, the first creditor benefits from the rule that because he is first, his interest was registered first, he is the first to get a hold of the asset, and whatever is left over after he has been satisfied may go to the others in the order of priority. But I'm on the safe side, I'm first. So if that works for my benefit, if this is something, in my favor, why should I not be able to vary that rule and say, if you pay me something, or for some other reason, I agree, even though my security interest is first, to let you go up ahead of me, so you go first. Let's simply exchange priority. Even though my security interest was established first, and you're second, because I like you, or because you pay me something, or for whatever reason, let's exchange rank. You go first, you go up, and I go down. I see no reason, and most laws, I think, don't see a reason why people should not be able to waive a benefit they have been given by law. Why should this be mandatory? Why should you not be allowed to exchange, positions and say, you go first, I go second? I mean, if I agree to do that, no injury done to me, no harm done to me. That's sort of freedom of contract. And that's something we'll see in the case. And as you know from the port-based clothing case, if you read it carefully, the question is, one of the questions of the case is, what exactly is the effect of such a, what they call a deed of priority? Deed is nothing but an agreement of priority. What is the true effect of such a deed? How do you do it right and how do you do it wrong? And one of the reasons why I chose this case to be included in the material along with the case that's reported in that case, sort of like these Russian dolls, where you have a doll and a doll and a doll. The Woodruff's music case, to be distinguished from port-based clothing. One of the reasons why I have it in there is not only to talk about, as a corporate finance issue, the priority of secured creditors and how this statutory order, whoever is first, second, and so forth, can be changed by agreement, but also to give you an idea of how, how English judges approach such a case. Because as a German lawyer, I have a strong feeling that a German judge would do it differently. And maybe a Chinese judge would also do it differently. But you can see, and that's important, because you cannot always assume that all judges in all countries do things the same way. Legal traditions are quite different. And I think from what you will see or have seen in the port-based clothing case, at least in commercial litigations, English judges, it's my feeling, I'm not an English lawyer, but from what I've read, seem to take frequently a very formal approach. Look at the agreement, what have you said, and will enforce it according to the wording of the agreement, even if we know that what you intended to do is not what the wording seems to suggest. So the wording is one thing, I see actually what you wanted to do, and you didn't put this into words properly, so the words say something different from what you actually intended. And the judge, at least in Germany, would say, I give, and he would have to, I give effect to your intentions. But the English judge says, in commercial matters, you have all legal advice, I give effect to the wording. This is what you wrote. Sometimes, and we may see other cases where the judge actually know what you try to do. I'll also tell you how you could have done it in a proper way, but that's not the way you didn't do it. That's not the way you did it. You did it in a different, defective way, and therefore tough luck. That's actually the effect here in the port-based cloning case, and that's something to be wary of. That you can't rely in all countries on judges giving effect to your intentions or the intentions of the parties that you have advised. In some countries, they take you by your word, even if they know that what the wording says is sort of not the proper reflection of the intentions. And they know the intentions, and nevertheless they say, too bad, we see what you wanted to do, but unfortunately you didn't write it into your contract, and therefore we cannot enforce it. One of the reasons why English judges, I think, do that is because, as you know from other classes probably, or from practice, contracts are frequently very, very long and very, very detailed. You have sometimes contracts, the English or American style contracts, that have hundreds and hundreds of pages with 50 pages of definitions, taking account of every possible event that people have envisaged when they drew up the contract. And you remember from last class when we talked about loan contracts, and I said in Germany you have some statutory fallback rules, you have rules on standard general business terms, where you scrutinize and assess certain clauses in the contract, and they may be invalid as a matter of law. In English law, American law, nothing like that. You have to put it in your contract. There is no statute to help you. So you have to take care of everything. That's why the contracts are very long. And if you have such a very long and detailed contract, the judge is reluctant to meddle in it and say, here, this little piece I'll change. This little piece I'll interpret different from the wording, because you don't know what effect that might have on other clauses. So the assumption is you have a carefully balanced contract negotiated by legal counsel who are experienced, and I must assume that because this clause is phrased like that, and it gives a benefit to party A, the other clause gives a benefit to party B, and if I change that a little bit and give, instead of a benefit to party A, the benefit to party B, then the balance is not there anymore, and I don't know what effect that might have on other clauses. Therefore, I will not interfere. I will just enforce the contract as it has been worded, because I have to assume that you did this all very carefully. The German tradition or continental tradition is quite different. If you were at the conference yesterday and heard the last presentation, statute traditionally in Europe, at least since the 1800s, late 1700s, there's a tradition of statutes that have rules for many different types of contracts. And traditionally, at least before the whole market here changed in the 90s, also the lawyer's market, traditional German type contracts used to have maybe 20, 25 pages, where the English or American counterpart had 500 pages. Why is that? Because of two things. First of all, whatever was in the statute, you did not put in the contract. You only addressed issues that were not regulated by statute. And whatever was regulated by statute in a way that you found to be all right, you didn't put in your contract. So that already took care of quite a few things. Secondly, there is a rule in German law and also other continental laws that the judges have to give effect to the intentions of the parties. Or we have explicit provisions in our civil code that say contracts have to be interpreted so as to give effect to the intentions of the parties, even if the wording is defective. So lawyers said it's enough so that we address the most important issues and that it becomes clear from the contract what the intentions of the parties are. And if there are then some loopholes left, we know that the judge will fill these holes, so as to give effect to the intentions of the parties. There is not such a great risk of unpleasant surprises that a judge will say, there is an issue, you didn't regulate this explicitly in your contract, and therefore tough luck. He will say, there is an issue, it's not explicitly regulated in the contract, I will look at what the parties tried to do, what balance they sought to strike with the contract, and then I will fill this, shortcoming, this hole in the contractual, in the system of the contractual provisions, so as to make it consistent and to give effect to the intentions of the parties. So for these reasons, or these are some of the reasons why on the continent the contracts used to be fairly short, which in turn meant if you have a contract of 20 or 25 pages without many definition sections and so forth, one or two lawyers could write that up, and also as the negotiations went on can adapt it to the current state of negotiations. You don't need a team of 20 people to do that. 2 people, 1 person can do it. This person has to be a smart person who knows everything. It's not just mechanical work. I search for the term so-and-so, and when it has been changed in negotiations, then I look through 500 pages, where does that term pop up, and make all the changes. I mean, sort of a monkey can do that, or a machine can do that. Here, now, currently you have associates doing that for, I don't know, €300 an hour, a team of 20 people doing this, as negotiations go on. You didn't have to used to do that. That's why also a reason German law firms until the 1990s, continental law firms until the 1990s were very small. The largest German law firm in 1990 maybe had 40 lawyers in Cologne. That used to be considered a huge law firm, 40 lawyers. There was also another rule that said a law firm can only be established in one place, in the area of jurisdiction of a specific court. So a law firm could not have branches nationwide, only had to be established in the jurisdiction of one appellate court, so for example Cologne, Frankfurt, Munich, but not other areas. So in the 1990s when that rule fell, because I think of jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice, they had to abandon that rule, so now law firms could establish offices nationwide or even other countries, European countries. And when, mostly through finance, innovations coming from the States over England to Germany, the types of contract changed. The type of drafting of contract changed. You had new players in this financial markets who were used to the English and American way of drafting contracts, and they expected contracts to be drafted like that. So these two factors, English and American firms could now enter the German market and merge with German firms because you were not, restricted to having one office in one place. You could have sort of law firms with many branches in Germany and other countries. So this was the entry for English and American law firms. Plus the new way of drafting contracts completely changed the market for lawyers. Now you have large law firms, almost no genuine German law firms, large German law firms left, all merged with English or American firms. So look at Friedrichs Burkhardt Deringer, Linklaters, Clifford, all used to be German firms taken over or merging with English firms. Hengler Müller is one of the still left over genuine German firms, and Gleis Lutz. And some others like Nöhr are German, but many of the firms merged and became very large. And the style of drafting contracts changed. And also, of course, the way lawyers made money changed, because if you have 2 lawyers working, you can charge hours for 2 people. If you have 20 associates working, 2,500 hours a year, and therefore generating income of, a turnover of 750,000 euro, but the cost of the associate is only 350,000, means 400,000 goes to the partner. So earnings of partners in law firms drastically increased, I think. So these are all changes due to sort of changes in in the market, like contract with expectations of the parties, how are contracts drafted, and changes in the setup of law firms. The type of the English type contracts, you know, they sort of almost never go to court in Germany. You either have what do you call it, arbitration clauses, or you don't go to court, because you wouldn't want a German judge who is used to the German way of doing things, like give effect to the intentions of the parties, to adjudicate an English-style contract where the parties expect don't change anything, just look at the wording, don't change anything, don't try to make sense of it in any other way that you think is better or more fair. That's why in Germany they almost never go to court. That's why still German judges would decide the cases we'll be talking about in a minute, I think differently from the English judge who is used to that. You know, legally advised parties, experienced, you know, they have to take care of their own affairs, and if they fail to do so, tough luck. Now, the last thing before we start looking at the case has to do with an issue that plays a central role in port-based clothing, and that is the floating charge. Because there's always talk of a security interest, a floating charge established, a floating charge established. Did you gather from the materials what a floating charge is? So the specific type of English security interest that you don't find anywhere else? Floating charge, what is it? I mean, you don't have to give a technical explanation, just your feeling or impression of what does a floating charge do, how does it work?
Is it for the companies, the merchant, they can use your materials, your products to add the security to the creditor, and when before the crystallization, the price or the value of the security is not confirmed. After the crystallization, then it is confirmed.
Yeah, yes, pretty good. So floating charge is a security interest that allows you to give some security to your creditor without impairing your ability to continue business. I mean, think back of the example with a mortgage over real estate. I establish a mortgage on a piece of real estate, and when I sell it, the mortgage goes with the real estate, so I can only sell an asset that's encumbered. Maybe I can live with that with a piece of land. But imagine if I have other assets like my products that I have produced and I want to sell. I need to sell them because otherwise I can't pay off my debt. If they were all encumbered in that same way that I could only sell to my customers products on which there is a security interest for a creditor, nobody would buy it, right? So the floating charge is a neat way of taking care of both of these interests. One is the interest of creditors to have some sort of security interest. The other is the interest of the owner of the business to be able to use his assets or her assets to continue doing business even though the security interest has been established. And the floating charge, as you rightly say, is a nice way of doing it because you establish the floating charge usually over all of your business. It could also be over part of your business, but you can establish it over all of your business. But until a certain trigger is pulled, usually bankruptcy, default on other debts. So anything that can be defined as an event of crystallization, when you say, oh, now I really want a security interest. I don't want to allow you to continue your business anymore and sell the assets over which I have a security interest. Now I want to enforce it with priority over other creditors. When such an event occurs, called crystallization, then it's like sort of a bird of prey, like an eagle swooping over the rabbit, and then when crystallization occurs, the eagle swoops down, it catches the rabbit, and then the rabbit can't continue to run anymore. That's crystallization, and then it becomes a fully fledged security interest. So that's the idea. So if you have, as a creditor, as a holder of a floating charge, you already have more than an unsecured creditor, sort of a dormant security interest, a potential security interest, but you can allow your debtor to continue the business, sell the assets so to pay off the debt. But if things go wrong, crystallization occurs, sort of everything stops, no more business, all the assets are now encumbered with this crystallized floating charge. And the whole story is complicated a little bit because the jurisprudence of the English courts regarding floating charges, especially floating charges over what they call book accounts, has changed over time back and forth. What do you need to establish a valid floating charge over book accounts or a fixed charge over book accounts? So charges over book accounts, that has changed. The term book accounts is not sort of a term in everyday language. What are book accounts? Any idea what's a book account? Sounds complicated, like covenant is just another word for an agreement. What's a book account? It's just a claim evidenced in a ledger, a book account, usually a bank account. You have an account with your bank, that's booked, entered into some paper or electronic ledger, that's a book account. Yeah. So that's all. Usually book accounts are bank accounts. They could also be accounts with customers where you have a claim against the customer, and that's a book account as well. So claims evidenced in some piece of paper or electronic ledger, that's a book account. Nothing mysterious. The book accounts we're talking about in our cases are bank accounts. You have an account with the bank owes you something, or you owe the bank something, that's a book account. And fixed charge or floating charge over a book account means a security interest over the claim that you have against the person who owes you money. That's all. You have a positive balance on your current account in the bank, 50,000 euro. Security interest over the book account means that's a security interest, fixed charge, floating charge over the claim that you have against the bank. That's all. Pretty simple. See anything else that I should address before we go into the case? No, let's do the rest as we move along. Just a little bit, not much presentation, because this is a class where I want to discuss the case and want you to tell me what the problem and what the issue is. Just the story first. We have a company, port-based clothing, so don't need to, I don't know exactly what they did, but I suppose manufacture clothing, that's why the name. And they established the first debenture. Debenture is just a debt, evidenced by a piece of paper. I owe you money, a debenture. I hereby declare and hereby give you evidence that I owe you money, secured by fixed and floating charges over all of the company's assets in favor of Lloyd's Bank. Then, a little bit later, let's see, I have to look for something here. A second debenture, secured by a floating charge in favor of the directors for an advance of £82,000. The directors of the company had lent the company money, £82,000, and in order to secure their claim against the company, they obtained look for the right provision in the English Act. Just a second. Here. Okay. So a second security interest, again, over all of the company's assets for the directors. And then you could see the company didn't do very well because the debts increased. And now they obtained a £200,000 loan from trustees of Morrison's fashion pension scheme. So in order to reduce their bank debt. So as I read the story here, the bank got nervous and said, we're going to enforce our claim and drive you into bankruptcy unless you pay off at least some of your debt. So the company looks for money. Where can I get that from? Why did they go to a pension scheme, Morrison Fashion's pension scheme? And why would a pension scheme, I don't know the details, but pension scheme sounds to me, employees and the employer, maybe both or one of them, pays in money in order to give the employees pensions when they retire. So why would a pension scheme lend money to the company so that the company can pay to another company so that the company can pay off its bank loan or part of it?
For getting back returns, that when you give out money like this to say a company like port-based loan, you get back interest if you invest in a venture.
You can say that's a great investment because we get lots of interest, but I mean, on the other hand, you're a pension scheme, people rely on receiving the money when they retire. So usually, I don't know how it is in your countries, but in Germany, insurances, pension funds have certain rules on how they may invest. And the rules are usually, at least a large amount, has to be invested in safe investments. That's why, for example, rating is so important. There has to be safe, because the focus is not on getting such a as high a return as possible, even if it's associated with a lot of risk. Because if the risk materializes, then people are out of a pension. So it's more important to make less profit, generate less interest, but save interest, so that you can keep your promise to the pensioners. Rather than, with a hedge fund, you take lots of risk because I put up a stake and I gamble, and if it goes well, wow, great profit. If it goes wrong, okay, I lost the money, that was the bet. With your pension, you probably wouldn't want to do that. With extra money, yes, not with a pension. So again, the question, and this is just guessing, but looking at the story and the case and the names of the companies, why was the pension scheme approached, and why did it?
Maybe because the pension scheme wants to keep the company, because the pension scheme is a more fashion pension scheme. Maybe the employee, the people is a worker for a clothes factory.
Yeah, port-based clothing, Morrison Fashions. And I remember from the case, the two companies, Morrison Fashions and Port-Based Clothing, were associated. So Port-Based Clothing may be the parent company, Morrison Fashion a subsidiary company. I think even the directors were trustees of the pension scheme. So the directors of Port-Based Clothing, if I remember correctly, were also at the same time trustees of the pension scheme. You wonder why? Because they're associated companies, belong to the same group. That's why they did it. I don't know if it was legal at the time to do that, but they did it because they said, we're one family, we have to save the company, and the only way to do it is take money from the pension scheme and give it to Morrison, to Port-Based Clothing, so they can pay off some of the debt and continue business. And so they receive a third debenture in favor of the trustees with fixed and floating charges over all of the company's assets. But now the trustees were a little bit nervous and said, taking money from a pension scheme, that's a critical thing. So we want to be sure that we, with our fixed and floating charges, rank first. We rank ahead of everyone, so if things do go wrong, the pensioners are not the ones to suffer. And when we talk about, secured debt and variation of priority, why can you, so in between subordination by contract, so the effect was deed of priority, these two agreed to be subordinated to these people. So subordination by contract, in our case, subordination of secured debts. All of these people had secured claims, and they entered into an agreement by which they wanted to subordinate their claims against Port-Based Clothing to the trustees' claim against Port-Based Clothing. Why is that in corporate finance? In the mezzanine finance part, well, it's not equity financing, it is debt financing, but the twist is that some of the debt is subordinated to other debt. And subordination is sort of a feature of equity. Equity holders are subordinated to creditors. And that feature you see here, some creditors subordinated to others. Therefore, mezzanine in between, architecture, first floor, ground floor in between. We're creditors, but at the same time, we're a little bit in a position, or our debt has a little bit of a feature of that of shareholders, in that we are subordinated to other creditors. In this case, by voluntary agreement. Next time we talk about not voluntary, involuntary. I don't agree to it. It's just by operation of law that I'm subordinated. But this is why this is mezzanine, in between features of debt, and the subordination part is a feature of equity. Okay, so this is what they wanted to do. This is the agreement. And then the story continues a little bit later. 16 January, they lent the money. In May, company is placed into liquidation, involuntary liquidation. Creditors apply for the company to be wound up. So it didn't last very long. It was not successful, the attempt to save the company. The total proceeds from liquidation of the assets was £97,000. And now if you see here, the company, they lent 82,000. The bank had 350,000. They lent 200,000. You can already see there is certainly not enough for everyone. So we had liabilities, 154,000 interest to the bank, because the bank had claims of 350,000 in January, minus 200,000 reduction of, in January by the money from the pension scheme, plus probably 4,000 interest in between January and May. So that's why I would read it 154,000. The directors, 82,000 or 83,000 secured by, what they wanted was a floating charge, by a floating charge, and the pension scheme with interest, fixed and floating charges over all the company's asset. Then the Internal Revenue Service tax obligations of 30,000, almost 40,000 pounds, and then on top of that, another almost 130,000 pounds of unsecured debt. Proceeds, barely 100,000. So now you can see priority and rank is a big issue. That's a big issue. Who has the first bite into the assets? And imagine it were the bank, that everything would go to the bank and nothing would be left for the others. Or the trustees, everything to the trustees, nothing left for the others. Before we look at the effect of the deed of priority that it had here and the security interests of the parties, we need to remind ourselves of, because we have tax debt to the Internal Revenue Service, of a provision that was mentioned in the case, that is section 175 of the Insolvency Act. In a winding up, the company's preferential debts shall be paid in priority to all other debts. And then there is subsection 2, preferential debts so far as the assets of the company available for payment of general creditors are insufficient to meet them, have priority over the claims of holders of debentures secured by or holders of any floating charge created by the company, and shall be paid accordingly out of any property comprised in or subject to that charge. Which means the statutory order of priority would be fixed charge, mortgage, any sort of security interest with which an asset is encumbered that basically takes the asset out of the estate of the insolvent party. So fixed charge is first, because priority only over unsecured creditors or creditors holding a floating charge. Then preferential debt, and then floating charge would be, so that would be the order of priority. If we go, statutory order would be fixed charge, preferential debt, floating charge, and unsecured. Okay, now if we look at if we go back a slide and see what are the security interests, we would think, well, you know, pretty simple. The bank has fixed and floating charges over all the assets, including the bank account on which these 95,000 or 96,000 pounds or 98,000 pounds now sit. So all the company now has, after it has been liquidated, is a book debt, sort of a claim against the bank from its account on which you have 98,000 pounds. Then you have floating charges in favor of the directors. Okay, tough luck, preferential debt before the floating charge, fixed charge before floating and preferential debt. And you have the trustees with a 200,000 pound claim secured by fixed and floating charges. So you'd say, if you look at this, the trustee, the bank has a fixed charge, the trustees have a fixed charge over the bank account. Now, what's the order of priority between those two fixed charges? The normal order would be whoever comes first is first. So the bank would be first, the trustees second, but they have the deed of priority, and we said, and I think agreed, I mean, you can exchange your priority if you want to do that. The reason could be because you're paid. The reason for the bank was if they hadn't agreed to that deed of priority, the whole scheme of borrowing from the pension scheme would not have worked, the pension scheme would not have lent the money, the bank would not have gotten the 200,000 pounds. So they said, you know, sort of balancing, is it better to have a first security interest for 350,000 pounds and no money paid? Or is it better to get 200,000 pounds now and forego and waive the first position for the other 150,000? And they, for some reason, and they were smart, because 5 months later the company was bankrupt and that's what's left. So they were smart. Had they kept the first rank and said, no, we don't enter into the deed of priority, we keep our first rank for the whole 350, they would have gotten in liquidation barely 100,000 pounds and would have been left with 250,000 outstanding debt. This way, only 154, so it was a smart move by the bank. And the price to pay was exchange the rank. So what we would say is, okay, the company has, or the pension scheme has a fixed charge in the first position. Fixed charge is first, and therefore the 97,000 pounds, 98,000 pounds go to the bank, go to the pension scheme, I'm sorry. Then we wouldn't have a case. Would it be finished very simple? Would just be a case on English security interests. Why did that not work? And here's where the story becomes a little bit complicated. And I also have material for you, if you want to read it, on the sort of jurisprudence of the English courts on floating and fixed charges over book debts. There's a long line of cases, and the most recent cases are on the website or e-learning platform. If ever you happen to, you have to look at it, you can do that. Why did that not work? What went wrong? What went wrong in the case? Because I think we all agree the way I described it would have been simple. You know, two fixed charges, exchanging rank, pension scheme first, for 200,000 pounds, proceeds of liquidation less than 100,000, everything would go to the pension scheme. But that's not the outcome. Why not? What went wrong? Any idea? Anyone, any idea? I think it was all in the case. Just need to read the case and understand the case.
Because according to the court's decision, the trustees debenture created a floating charge on the book account instead of fixed charge.
Why only a floating charge and not also a fixed charge?
Sorry, that reason I didn't understand.
Okay. Because they said in order to have a fixed charge over something immaterial, like book debts, like a claim. That's something not physical. In order to have a fixed charge over that, you need to have control over the claim and what happens with the proceeds of the claim. If you cannot control it, then you don't have a security interest. I mean, if you have, for example, a mortgage over land, and it's registered in the land register or whatever the register may be, then you have control, because you can point to the register and say, here, this is my mortgage, this is my security interest, no matter what you do with the land, whether you sell it or not, it stays here and it has first priority. More difficult with something that's not physical. So a fixed charge, in order to have a security interest where you say, this basically belongs to me, you want some evidence that you have, of your control over that asset. And so the court said, and I mean, that's not a natural law, but that's what the English courts say, in order to recognize that a creditor has a fixed charge over book debts, this creditor has to have control over the account where the proceeds, on which the proceeds are paid. Who has control over the account? The bank. So Port-Based Clothing had its account with the bank. I don't know what the name of the bank was in the case, I don't remember. What's the name there? No. Lloyd's Bank. So they had their account with Lloyd's Bank. And Lloyd's Bank had therefore control over the book debts, over the sort of the claims of Port-Based Clothing against Lloyd's Bank, because the bank could decide what to do with the money on the account. You give the bank an order, transfer the money to the trustees' fashion scheme, and they say, no, we don't do it. So they have control. They can stop the owner, they can stop Port-Based Clothing to use the funds on the account in a way that the bank doesn't like. Maybe they're not doing it illegally, or maybe they're violating some agreement, but they have control. So they have control over the book debts, over the claims of Port-Based Clothing against the bank, because they can determine what to do with the positive balance on the account. The positive balance on the bank account after liquidation was 98,000 pounds. That's the balance you have on your account. That's the book debt of the bank to the company or its liquidator. And the bank has control over that account. It can stop the company from doing things with it that the bank doesn't like. And that's why the bank succeeded in establishing a fixed charge, but the fashion scheme, the pension scheme did not succeed in getting a fixed charge, because Morrison's fashion pension scheme did not have control over the bank account. So when the money was paid on the account and Port-Based Clothing wanted to pay over debt, the fashion scheme could have objected, but that would have had no effect. They could not have stopped management from doing with the money on the account whatever management wanted. So no control, therefore no fixed charge. So that's the first thing that went wrong. The bank succeeded in getting a fixed and floating charge, but the pension scheme succeeded only in getting a floating charge, not more. So what we have now is the bank with a fixed charge. Then we have the preferential debts of the Internal Revenue Service. So here, bank with a fixed charge, then Internal Revenue Service, and then the trustees with a floating charge, because 175, Section 175 says preferential debt is to be paid before a floating charge. So the order now would be fixed charge of the bank, preferential debt, floating charge of the trustees. And now the question is, how does the deed of priority work? You know, once we kicked out the fixed charge for the pension scheme, which was not validly established. And there are two readings how the deed of priority works. One is adopted by the Port-Based Clothing Court. One is adopted by the Woodruff's Music Court. Where you have basically the same thing. You have sort of a debt secured by floating charges over all of the company's assets in favor of a bank. Then Mrs. Woodruff gives a loan secured by a floating charge ranking immediately after the bank. Then Mrs. Woodruff gives notice and converts her fixed floating charge into a fixed charge, which means under the law in the 1980s, now suddenly whoever gives notice first and succeeds in converting the floating charge to a fixed charge has the first priority. Bank serves demand for repayment, and the liquidation proceeds are insufficient to pay the bank, Mrs. Woodruff, and the bank creditors. So the order of priority here would be Mrs. Woodruff with her charge, because after it's been converted into fixed charge, she's first. And then the preferential creditors, and then only the bank with its floating charge. And again, you have a deed of priority whereby Mrs. Woodruff said, you know, as far as my £25,000 go, I let you, the bank, go ahead of me. Same issue. So basically we have the same, in both cases, we have the same problem. Which is we have a fixed charge debt and floating charge. Fixed charge here, Lloyd's Bank, or Miss Woodruff. Preferential debt, tax, and here, in the one case, the pension scheme. Or the bank. So that would be the regular order of priority, and now we have in both cases deed of priority. That says, you know, even though you rank behind me, I agree to let you first. I let you go first. And the question in both cases was, what is the effect, the true effect of that deed of priority? And both cases arrive, or both judges arrive at different conclusions. And there are two ways in which to read them. One very literal way, that's the Port-Based Clothing judge, and a way that gives effect to the intentions of the parties, that's the Woodruff's Music judge. Let's first look, because that's easier, intuitively easier to understand. What's the sort of way of interpreting this deed of priority in a way that gives effect to the intentions of the parties? And we'll 5,000, and here say 100,000. What's the way, what would you, sort of unbiased understanding of this deed of priority, what would it do? What would be the effect? So I'm putting numbers on. Let's say she has a fixed charge of 25,000, preferential debt for the tax authorities, and the bank has 100,000 claims secured by a floating charge. And now the deed of priority, where Mrs. Woodruff kindly agrees, you, bank, can go ahead of me. What would be the effect? What did the parties want to do? Assuming a rule, I want to, I interpret the agreement so as to give effect to the intentions of the parties. Parties being Ms. Woodruff and the bank. Simple.
Ms. Woodruff would be ranked lower than the bank. So first the preferential debt would be settled, then the bank, and then Ms. Woodruff.
Yeah, but let's say, is that what the parties wanted? That the preferential debt is first, and then the bank, and then Ms. Woodruff, and then so there is nothing left for either of them?
No, but the contract, the deed of priority is between Ms. Woodruff and the bank, but the preferential debt holders have nothing to do with this.
Okay, so you're interpreting it. Okay, you're interpreting it as the court-based clothing judge did. You look at the wording, and the wording says, "I agree that the floating charge ranks ahead of the fixed charge. That the floating charge ranks again ahead of the fixed charge." Okay, so what does that mean when the floating charge ranks ahead of the fixed charge? The judge says, well, the floating charge is behind the preferential debt. And if you agree that the floating charge ranks ahead of the fixed charge, that means the fixed charge goes down here. Mm-hmm. That's the effect. It doesn't mean that I take you on your you take me on your shoulders. It means I take you. You take me on your shoulders down here. You go down. That's what the effect is. The wording is, and that's very literal. Fixed charge ranking behind the floating charge. That doesn't mean that the floating charge changes its position vis-a-vis the preferential debt. Mm-hmm. So by agreeing to that fixed charge ranking behind floating charge, you have implicitly agreed to rank also behind the preferential debt. Mm-hmm. So the effect is obviously the wording. Yeah, it's consistent with the wording. Mm-hmm. And they say, the judge even says in port-based clothing, we know what you wanted to do. You wanted to exchange a rank. You wanted these two to exchange rank, mm-hmm. floating charge to be here and fixed charge to be here. That's not what you said. And therefore, we will take you by your word, saying floating charge against you, before you, which means since these two, they were not party to it, they stay where they are, you stay where you are, and it's just you going behind. Obviously, that's not what the parties wanted. Mm-hmm. Let's say the tax is 50,000, and let's assume proceeds of liquidation are 45,000. That would mean everything goes to the tax, nothing left for the two. The deed of priority would have had the effect that neither of the two creditors would get anything. Is that what they wanted? The answer is clearly no. I mean, why should we have an agreement in favor of the preferential creditor? Of course you wouldn't want that. That's why the Woodruff Music judge said, no, we see what, the wording may be defective, but of course we see what you wanted to do. We said you two wanted to exchange rank. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Woodruff, wanted to give the bank the prior position in your stead and agreed to step down on the bank's level behind the preferential creditors. That's what you agreed to. Now, when we look at the numbers here, we see there is a problem because Mrs. Woodruff, with her first position, had a claim of only 25,000. But the bank had a claim of 100,000 in my example here. So can Mrs. Woodruff give the bank a first position for 100,000 where she only has a claim of 25,000 and a first level security interest for only 25,000? I mean, that would be a problem because then you say, here we have 45,000 liquidation proceeds. If everything had gone according to the statutory order, Mrs. Woodruff would have gotten 25,000 and then 20,000 would have been left for the tax. If I can allow the bank to go up with their whole 100,000, then all of the 45,000 will go to the bank and there will be nothing left for the tax. So what the effect would have been is an agreement between the bank and Ms. Woodruff would have worked to the detriment of the tax authorities who were not part of it. And that, I think, was your concern. And I think we all agree you cannot allow parties to bargain at the expense of somebody else. You know, that doesn't work. So we have a problem here that the Woodruff's music judge has to take care of, because here a first security interest for 25,000, here a third security interest, third level after the preferential debt of 100,000, a deed of priority. I mean, I can't simply let Ms. Woodruff give a first position to the bank for 100,000. That can't work. And the answer, I think, is very simple.
Mr. Woodford gets all the 25,000 and give that proceeds to bank directly.
Yeah, that's what the port-based clothing judge said. You know, your wording defective. You know, you said fixed charge behind floating charge, and therefore the floating charge ranks behind the fixed charge ranks behind the floating charge, but the floating charge stays where it is, and the preferential debt ranks first. Dumb, stupid drafting. You could have done it differently. You could have agreed Mrs. Woodruff or the pension scheme or the bank collects in favor of the pension scheme. So why? You could have had an agreement in the port-based clothing case. Lloyd's Bank stays where it is, but collects the proceeds of liquidation, you know, sort of as a trustee for the pension scheme, and then gives the money to the pension scheme. That would have worked. So that's sort of frustrating for the parties, because the court even tells them, you could have done it this way, you could have done it that way, we see what you wanted to do, and you could have done it in a technically better way, but you didn't do it, and therefore tough luck. And that's what the court said in port-based clothing. You know, you could have agreed Lloyd's Bank collects the £97,000 on behalf of the pension scheme, and then outside of the liquidation, it gives the money to the pension scheme. That would have been perfectly legal. But you didn't do it. And here in Woodruff's music, they didn't do it either. They didn't say Mrs. Woodruff collects 25,000 in favor of the bank and then gives the money to the bank. They simply said, we exchange priority. And again, we have the problem. This first priority is for 25,000, whereas the third level security interest is for 100,000.
When you exchange priority like this, can you just exchange it to the extent of your debt?
Absolutely good point. There is a rule, at least a old Roman law saying you cannot give more than you have. Nobody can give more than he has. She has a first priority for £25,000. That's all she can give. She cannot give first priority for 100,000 if she doesn't have it. What she can give is first priority for £25,000, and that's what the Woodruff music judge says happened. So the bank and Mrs. Woodruff exchange rank for the 25,000 for which Mrs. Woodruff has first priority. So first the bank collects £25,000. Then comes the tax. Then comes the bank again for the rest, and then Mrs. Woodruff. And in my numbers, we stop here, 25,000 to the bank, and then 20,000 to the tax, and that's it. But if you had more money, if you had 145, you know, 25,000 to the bank means 120 left, 50,000 to the tax, 70,000 left, 70,000 to the bank. That's the way it would be done. So the idea is give effect to the intentions of the parties without impairing the interests of of third parties who are not involved in this agreement. In this case, the tax authority. And so what the Woodruff's music judge said, and I think what a German judge would say to a case like this is, why should the preferential creditor, the tax authorities, care to whom the money goes for which the first security interest is established? Why should they care whether it goes to Ms. Woodruff, to the bank, or somebody else? As long as it is only 25,000, they have to accept that. It's no concern of theirs. Why should they make a windfall profit like in port-based clothing? Because the agreement is drafted defectively, so that now Ms. Woodruff ranks behind the bank and all the money goes to the tax. Surprising windfall profit, that's not your position, that's not what you bargained for. and that's not the position the law gave you. So those are the two readings, one very literal wording, port-based clothing. Court says, you agreed to rank behind the floating charge. This is where the floating charge ranks. The agreement means you rank behind them. It's clearly not what you wanted to do because now all the money goes to the tax and you get nothing. But tough luck, you could have done it differently by agreeing that the bank serves as a trustee for the pension scheme, or that the bank collects on behalf of the pension scheme and passes on the money. All valid ways of doing it, but you haven't done it. Too bad. So basically you're punished for having lawyers who are not very good. Tough luck. Whereas the Woodruff's music judge, and I would suggest also a German judge, would say we give effect to the intentions of the parties to the point where as long as third parties' interests are not impaired, which means to whom the 25,000 go doesn't matter. And for that amount, you can exchange rank, and we give effect to your agreement that the bank ranks ahead of the preferential bank. For the rest, the bank stays behind. So first the bank with the 25,000 because of the deed of priority, then the tax, and then if something is left, the bank, and then Ms. Woodruff. The reason why we did this so extensively, even though the cases are not extremely complicated, is because first of all I wanted to say a couple of words on security interests and the role security interests play in lending of companies, borrowing of companies. So corporate finance, even though we don't do a whole class on security interests in 3 jurisdictions, but security interests are clearly important. To introduce you to that concept of a floating charge in English law, because it's an important type of security interest in commercial lending in England. And then to discuss how such agreements are interpreted by judges, how they can be interpreted. And we clearly saw there are 2 ways of reading it and giving effect to it. And we saw that even 2 English judges did that in a different way. And what you should take away is, if you ever have to do with common law jurisdictions, especially England or related jurisdictions, you have to be aware of the danger that a judge will interpret a contract very literally. It's not enough that you can show these were the intentions. He may know it and still say, tough luck, we see what you wanted to do, but you didn't do it properly. Okay, the second case, for which I don't have a slide because I don't need one, we don't need one for that, was Ray Maxwell case.
I have a question of this case as well. What about, it's another litigation process, it's about a bankruptcy restructuring process. Because during the bankruptcy restructuring, the other creditors may compromise or maybe forgive about their credits, and they may have another agreement between each other. So what about these kind of agreements?
Of course you could do that. You can have some scheme of arrangement in English law, and in the liquidation you can agree to all sorts of things. Sure, you could. On the other hand, why should they didn't do that, however, in this case. There was no such arrangement during liquidation. And the liquidation in both cases was done so that the assets of the company were sold off. And then, until the case went to court, because in both cases, I think the Internal Revenue Service complained, or the liquidator said, no, it doesn't work like that, the parties thought they were safe. Right? Even in port-based clothing, the pension scheme went to the liquidator and said, here, I want my money, and the liquidator said no, or the tax authority said no, and then it went to court, and then they found out that it was defective. So until then, they didn't see any reason to have an additional arrangement.
What I'm trying to say is that during the restructuring part, you may have another agreement about that.
Yeah,
and
okay.
The new agreement with the previous agreement Which one is valid?
Of course, if you have an agreement between A and B before bankruptcy, and then in bankruptcy you have an agreement between C and D, the agreement between A and B is unaffected. I mean, C and D cannot change the agreement between A and B. If A and B, who have an agreement before the bankruptcy, then in bankruptcy agree to change it, then they can do it. But I mean, bankruptcy cannot change valid agreements that have been made beforehand. So that, if they're not involved, that could not be changed. So here, that was a case, or two cases, case within a case as well, on subordination of secured debt. In Ray Maxwell, we had a case where creditors or holders of unsecured debt agreed on a variation of priority in bankruptcy. And the question was, can creditors vary the rule of what is in England, I think section 107 of the Insolvency Act, but I think it's a rule in all of bankruptcy, in most bankruptcy law, subject to the provisions of this act as to preferential payments, the company's property in a voluntary winding up shall on the winding up be applied in satisfaction of the company's liability pari passu, and subject to that application shall be distributed among the members according to their rights and interests in the company. That means, in short words, creditors of the same level, of the same order of priority, are treated the same way. So if there is enough for 10%, to satisfy 10% of each of those unsecured debts, everybody gets 10%. And in Ray Maxwell, you had an agreement that wanted to vary that rule and say, no, some of the creditors forego their claim for bankruptcy assets in favor of other creditors. You take my part as well. And the question is, can you do this? Can you vary a mandatory rule of law? That was the question. And as you saw from the case, there was quite a bit of discussion. And the key issue is, why is it mandatory? For whose benefit is that a mandatory rule? And there are two answers. One, of course, for the creditors, so that they cannot be treated unequally without their consent. But if this is for their benefit, to the extent that the rule is there for their benefit, there is no reason why they could not change it. I mean, they could receive the money in bankruptcy and give it to someone, give it to another creditor. If they had agreed to that, I collect on your behalf and give you the money. Why should they not be able to say, even in bankruptcy, I drop out of the race, you take my part? Why should they not be able to do it? And the reason could be, and that's the second reason why you have a mandatory rule, possibly, is to make the administration of the bankrupt estate feasible, possible, and not to make life for the receiver too difficult. Because if you have all sorts of agreements between the creditors that the bankruptcy receiver has to respect on top of the mandatory rules of the Bankruptcy Act, then things could get possibly very complicated. And the court goes into some details and says, there are some rules, for example, with set-off and so on, that, we don't allow you to vary because then it becomes too complicated. But, say one creditor drops out and the other creditor takes his share is not complicated. So no injury done to the person who forgoes his share in the estate, nor too complex for the receiver in bankruptcy, and therefore to that extent possible. The lesson to take away for corporate finance is agreements between unsecured creditors, junior and senior creditors, for example, of bonds or loans, can to some extent be varied, even in bankruptcy, even with effect to bankruptcy proceedings, so that you could give your share to someone else or give priority to someone else. Can be done, which is not evident because the rules of bankruptcy are mandatory law, and you are reluctant to recognize that mandatory law can be changed. But here, to the effect that third-party interests are not concerned, in this case, the interests of the liquidator, receiver are not impaired, it's possible. And then there was a last question on the assignment sheet on which I would like to spend the last 5 minutes. Where do I have my assignment sheet? A little hypothetical, which I wanted you to have a look at. And it also has to do with corporate finance, mezzanine finance, subordination, and therefore belongs in today's session. So we have A Limited, an English company that wants to acquire B GmbH, a German private company. Large manufacturer of car parts. The management of A plans to finance the acquisition partly with senior debt to be provided by C Bank Corporation. Here we have C Bank. And partly with unsecured loans and high-yield bonds. All debt is supposed to be repaid out of the cash flow generated by B's business operations. C insists that the bank says the claim of the other lenders must be effectively subordinated to its own claim. And as A's management asks you to propose at least 2 alternatives of ways by which the desired subordination can be achieved. And here, say X, Y, Z, bonds. So you have a couple of bond tranches that you want to raise money with, and you have the bank loan that you want to raise money with. And the bank says, I'm going to give you the loan, but only if I, come first before these bondholders. And the bondholders in turn would say, okay, we agree to be subordinated, but only if we get more interest, because the risk is higher. And now 2 alternative ways of doing it. Here they want 100% of that company. Eventually, that's the nice thing, they say all of the debt for your own acquisition is supposed to be paid by you eventually. So from your business profits, the money is supposed to be repaid. So how can that be done? What are 2 ways of achieving subordination of those bondholders below the bank? One way should be easy now. That's what we just talked about all the time. What could you possibly think of? One way of doing it. Unsecured, all unsecured. It's unsecured. An agreement between the creditors, subordination agreement. Would be one way of doing it. An intercreditor subordination agreement, that's what we just talked about all the time. The creditors, the representatives of the bondholders could agree, you negotiate the terms of the bond. A would probably be part of it and say, yes, we're willing to give you so and so much percent, so and so many percent. And then for that, the creditors, the bondholders, respectively the banks or whoever sort of issues or sort of advises, the bondholders would agree, the representatives of the bondholders would agree, yes, we agree to be subordinated here, that the bondholders are subordinated, because while the bank gets only 4% interest, we get 9% interest. So one way of doing it. So intercreditor agreement plus A. A, of course, also has to agree, because A has to agree how much interest to pay. Could be done that way. Now, it could also get complicated. What happens if not all of the bondholder representatives agree to that? So no, those agreements, we heard from from friends that these subordination agreements are crucial and critical in England, and some courts don't respect them, so too unsafe, we don't want that. How else could you do it? Using company law, for example. Using features of company law that we talked about in our first class to make sure that the bank is first and the bondholders are second.
Can bank transfer unsecured loan to secured loan?
Yeah, no security. No, it should be without security.
To ask the bondholders to convert the bonds into equity?
Yeah.
Bondholders don't want that. They don't want to be shareholders. They want their money back. They want a junk bond, 9% interest, 10% interest. What's a feature? What's the difference between debt and equity? Once again, the main feature.
The claims, the rank of the claims.
Yeah. So creditors first, shareholders last. Can you use that here? Can you use that feature of debt and equity for this transaction?
Unless the company A issued a bond.
Mm-hmm. So A issues the bond, and the bondholders become creditors of A. And that's why when profit is paid to A can use the profit to pay to the bondholders. Okay. And how can you give the bank a better rank than that?
Bank is the creditor of the B.
Yeah, and B, the loan goes to B. The loan goes to B. B gives the loan to A to pay, sort of basically to buy off the shares. But B is the debtor of the loan, which means when B makes profits out of its operations, the bank is a creditor of B. Therefore, the bank gets paid first. A is a shareholder of B and gets paid afterwards, and because the bondholders are creditors of the shareholder, they're in no better position than the shareholder himself. Therefore, by using the priority of creditors over shareholders, by having the shareholder issue the bond and the loan given to B, the company, and then the company basically passes on the money to A to pay sort of the shareholders of B. You can achieve that subordination. I used a private company for a purpose here because in some other courses you will probably talk about financial assistance, and that financial assistance is illegal. Financial assistance means, under European law, a public company may not finance the acquisition of its own shares by giving loans, advances, or other financial assistance to the purchaser of the shares. So if this were a public company, such financial assistance, I take up a loan and give you the money which I acquired so that you can buy my shares, would be illegal. But with a private company, it's possible and legal. That's why I chose this to be a private company, so that you couldn't say, oh, this is illegal financial assistance. So if this had been a public company, BAG, illegal financial assistance. Why is it illegal financial assistance that, for example, a public company is not allowed? And sort of case closed, right? This is it. This is sort of extra now and has nothing to do with the case. If this were an AG, it would be illegal for this company to take up a loan or give money otherwise to this company, to the purchaser, so that the purchaser can pay the purchase price for the shares, even if it passed on that money as a loan. So say they take up 10 million from the bank, so they have 10 million bank debt and 10 million on their bank account. They pass on the 10 million to A. Again, the asset side of the balance sheet changes. I don't have 10 million bank account, I have a claim of 10 million against A. So you'd say balance sheet wise it's the same. And then A uses those 10 million it has acquired through A and through B to buy the shares from the old shareholders. So in effect, with this loan, B would have financed its own acquisition. And you could say, why is this a problem? After all, B has a claim against A that A repays the loan, 10 million. So fine. Doesn't matter whether I have 10 million in the bank or 10 million claim against A. The problem why this is illegal is that typically in such cases, an acquisition vehicle purchases the shares, and the acquisition vehicle has nothing but the shares. So that means if the acquisition vehicle here fails to pay back the loan, what is it that you can enforce your claim against? I have a claim of 10 million, give me back my money. All you will find here is your own shares. And your own shares don't have any value, right? Because all you have now is a 10 million claim on your balance sheet, 10 million euro claim, that is essentially worthless because all you have to show for it is your own shares. And that's why, because there is this danger that you end up eventually enforcing your claim and finding only your own shares, and then you have pieces of paper that say these are shares in B company. What else does B company have? Nothing. And then the shares are worthless. And that's why financial assistance for public companies is illegal, and that's why in my example I used a private company where you don't have such a ban on financial assistance.
What if a company is not simply a vehicle, also has his own assets, like a big company?
And the financial assistance rules don't distinguish. Is this a company that could pay? Is this Siemens or is this just an SPV? They don't distinguish. They straight out ban, and that's due to European law.
The reason is not exist in that case if a company has also other assets to be enforced.
Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. Under German law, at least, financial assistance would still be invalid and illegal because this is all transposition of old European law, and English law and German law have kept this straight out ban, even though European law has now somewhat relaxed it and has sort of allowed a test and said, if there is a claim against the borrower and that claim is worth money and the management has come to that conclusion after careful assessment, blah, 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 then member states may allow such financial assistance, but England and Germany have not. And one of the reasons is because there are other techniques of doing it. The one technique is that the acquisition vehicle takes up the debt, and then the acquisition vehicle is eventually merged into the company, and by way of merger, this company disappears, and the surviving company, the acquired company, by operation of law, assumes its own acquisition liability, because that's part of the assets and liabilities of the company that ceases to exist. And this is deemed to be legal, and these are all pretty complicated mergers and acquisition questions, financing, but that's why the German legislator has seen no necessity. There are other ways of getting around it, and so you don't need to change the law. Okay, thanks very much for your patience. Next time, I think, finally, Dr. Bauer, right?
Yeah.
BMW, no, not BMW, Linde, the Linde case. Again, the reminder, Linde is a pretty long document that you need to read. Again, the reminder, I cannot give you any hints for what to look for. I'm not allowed to do that. Again, my advice is, if you have a long document that you need to read and you don't have photographic memory, you have to ask yourself what's important and what's not important. And it's certainly important to understand what a transaction is about. So the key features of a transaction you must understand. Then there are annexes included with balance sheet and whatever. Do I need to know all that by heart? Probably not as a lawyer. But I have to understand what the transaction is about. That I should know. Okay? So that's the way I think you should read the document. Unlike me, Dr. Bauer will not give you any answers. He will wait until you give the answers. If you're not able to give answers, then the class will drag on for a long time without any results. So, okay. Bye-bye.
就是那个，我已经第二种方法，对，第二种方法。
他把这个包给对，然后他是完全公开他剩下的钱实际上是那个，他把这个分后然后再来还这个。
然后
他如果是上市公司的话就不行。
我知道，有些就是
如果是上市公司的话，如果在 A 里面，但他最后如果他不还钱的话，他对他的 capital 不还钱，他说我是你的这部分，他有的东西没有钱去不能再说这个话，那你的那相当于我现在只有自己的一个把它给限制上市公司的话，它的那个在全球里面，他的那个他会自己来买，
就是最后他说
那我相当于是来按这个
就不会产生这种illegal的现象。他说他没有什么作为他的shares，如果 A 股还给他的这个 loan 的话，那为什么你去银行没有？为什么 private company 会这样不用呢？但是这个 public company 说的很好啊？为什么 public company？我的直觉感觉是public company 可能涉及到了别的。他是这样说。其实我觉得 private company 也有这个问题。对啊，但是他说他 doesn't exist 什么 financial system， 但是其实我觉得 private company 它也是股份啊。对啊，
最后如果 B 没有钱了 ，A 拿着他自己的股份去找他，那不就是自己拿着自己股份？那个
他说他是说他不存在 financial system， 对，是吧？
对。但是他说只有 public company 不可以赚，但我觉得 private company 也有股份也可以赚。
你觉得？
你问问他。
你刚才问他是这个问题。
对，然后他就是他就是这么跟我讲的。
然后他就去问老师了，是吗？
我不知道他问老师了啥。
Legislator says, you know,
你问问。
it's safer than private companies. So there is capital maintenance and all these rules for private companies are just more relaxed. And there are no uniform regulations. So financial systems they introduced in the company law directly because